I actually thought it would be good to talk about what it is that we are opposing. Not because I want to be negative, right? They always say, well, focus on what you're for, not what you're against. And we're clear about what we're for. We're for a government of action that fights for working families. We're for a national bank to replace the corrupt credit system of the United States, a bank that injects credit into communities where the purse strings of the nation are held in public hands, and the lending of money is done strategically in an overall economic vision for making a stronger country. We are for public control of our natural resources, oil, natural gas, coal, timber. These things should be in the public budget. We are for a jobs program to hire millions of Americans and put them to work building a strong country, paving the roads, building new high-speed railway, building new universities and schools, building new power plants, etc., a new works progress administration, a mass program to rebuild the United States and the infrastructure. And finally, we are for an economic bill of rights, like Roosevelt had proposed, the right to a job, the right to housing, the right to education, not as a handout, but rather as an investment in the nation, because it is human labor power that is the source of all wealth. And so if you want to have a strong economy, you need to utilize the labor power of every person. You need to educate the public. You need the public to be physically fit, strong, and healthy. So as an investment in the nation, we invest in our people. And all of this centers around a perspective that we call innovationism. Because what makes human beings unique is, unlike any other species, human beings take the environment around them and change it and master it and force the environment to serve them. And the entire history of human beings is a constant reinvention of our relationship with nature to get to a higher plane. No other species is capable of doing what human beings have done. Ants have been making their ant farms the same way for thousands of years. Bees have been making their bee hives the same way for thousands of years. Beavers have been making their beaver dams the same way for thousands of years. But in just 7,000 or 8,000 years, human beings have gone from hunter-gatherers living in the woods and caves to space travel, iPhones, artificial intelligence, nuclear power. Human beings have a unique creative ability to change their relationship with nature, to rise to a higher plane, to increase their life expectancy, to increase their population. And that is what defines humanity. And I would argue that is proof of the existence of God, of the higher power, because there is no way to define it other than that. Human beings have a spark of creative power. God is the creator of all things, and human beings have a spark of creativity, divinity within them that defines us, and that human history is a constant struggle, a battle to reach higher modes of production, higher levels of development, a more comfortable life for all, a higher life expectancy for all, a larger population. Human beings are very, very unique and special, and it is our ability to innovate that defines us. And that this was something that Marx knew, but this is also something you can find in the Christian Bible. This is also something you can find in the work of Confucius and great thinkers throughout history. This is human beings. We are innovative species, and this is something to celebrate. And because that is something to celebrate, and because human beings have this unique ability to build and strive for a higher plane, we obviously want to have an economic system and a political system and leadership that works to energize, unleash, and cultivate innovation and human creativity. We need a leadership that sees the beauty of what human beings are and what we are capable of being and doing, and will actively work to utilize that ability and apply it. But we don't have that right now. We have something very, very different, that the heights of the world are run by people with a very, very contrary view. And tonight we're going to talk about what that contrary view is, where it came from, what it's rooted in, and all of that. But before we get to that, we have to talk about the economic foundations, because there is not much discussion of this. Politics in our time is very crass. There's a lot of pointing fingers. This guy's no good. He's bad. This person's no good. They're bad. This woman's no good. She's bad. But we don't really get into the bigger questions. We can argue about this policy or that policy, this issue or this issue, this candidate and the other candidate, but we want to get into the bigger view. There is a global system that defines the world in this time. And my Marxist background taught me about this system and taught me to refer to this system as imperialism, the monopolistic stage of capitalism. And I believe that that analysis that was first put forward by Vladimir Lenin was correct. However, it complements analysis that was prior put forward by Henry Charles Carey and analysis that has since been put forward by Alexander Dugin and other geopolitical thinkers in Russia and in China in the recent decades. So I'm going to break down all three theories of what system rules the world today. And I don't think they contradict each other. I think they are almost how do I put this? They're almost just pointing to different sides of the same diamond. There's an old story about a group of blind men are presented with an elephant. And they cannot see the elephant with their eyes. They can only touch the elephant. And one of them describes the elephant as being a snake, and another describes the elephant as being flat, and another person describes the elephant as being round. And they're all saying true things because they all touched different parts of the elephant. And that none of them are lying. They're just pointing to, part of the elephant is like a snake, its trunk, right? Part of the elephant is very flat, its stomach. Part of the elephant is very round, right? And that we're pointing to different aspects of the same thing, and even the aspects pointed to overlap. So first, we'll talk about what Lenin said. What did Vladimir Lenin say? 1916, the world was ripped apart by the First World War. And the socialist movement was largely responsible for that war. And that's something that is painful. I've had people get very angry when I say that and leave comments. I'm never watching your channel again, Caleb. That's bullshit. The socialists did not cause the war. Well, actually, they did. World War I would never have happened without the British Labour Party, without the German Social Democratic Party, without the French socialist groups, the Austrian Social Democratic Party, the Marxist and labor groups that were supposed to represent the working class, that claimed they were building the labor movement and leading the workers to eventually take power. When 1914, August of 1914 came around, they sold out their principles, and they not only allowed but actively helped the First World War, the war to end all wars, the catastrophic disaster called World War I, to break out. They betrayed their promise to never support an imperialist war. They betrayed it. The Second International, the Socialist International, was dissolved. It was reformed after the war, but it was temporarily dissolved. And World War I took place, and 20 million people were sent to their deaths. And one of the people who was very, very angry about it was Vladimir Lenin. And he had been disagreeing with and vehemently at odds with the socialist and Marxist movement for quite some time. But when World War I broke out, and people he greatly admired, like Karl Kautsky, signed on to it and were signing up workers to go fight and die, at that point, Lenin came forward with his theory that capitalism, the economic system of capitalism, had entered a new stage called imperialism. And it was not regular, ordinary capitalism. It was imperialism. And in our book, We Are City Builders, the Center for Political Innovation's first textbook, we actually quote what Lenin said about what imperialism was. It's on page 21 of the CPI We Are City Builders textbook. And I will just read to you what Lenin said imperialism was, this new stage of capitalism. He said imperialism is a specific historical stage of capitalism. Its specific character is threefold. Imperialism is monopoly capitalism. Imperialism is parasitic or decaying capitalism. And imperialism is moribund capitalism. The supplanting of free competition by monopoly is the fundamental economic feature, the quintessence of imperialism. Monopoly manifests itself in 5 principal forms. 1, cartels, trusts, and syndicates. The concentration of production has reached a degree which gives rise to these monopolistic associations of capitalists. 2, the monopolistic position of big banks. 3, 4, or 5 giant banks manipulate the whole life of America, of France, and Germany. 3, the seizure of raw material by the trusts and the financial oligarchy. Finance capital is monopoly and industrial capital merged with bank capital. 4, the economic partition of the world by the international cartels has begun. They are already over 100 international cartels which command the entire world market and divide it amicably among themselves until war redivides it. The export of capital, as distinct from the export of commodities under non-monopolistic capitalism, is a highly characteristic phenomenon closely linked with the economic and territorial political partition of the world, and the territorial partition of world colonies is completed. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about an international financial oligarchy, bank capital merging with industrial capital to make a new form of corporation where finance, big banks are dominant. The creation of these monopolistic associations that then start seizing territories in the colonized world. The export of capital rather than the export of commodities. Instead of exporting products, we're exporting the corporations themselves. We don't export French fries, we export McDonald's. McDonald's goes all over the world, right? Instead of exporting tires, we export Goodyear, right? That the corporations, the monopolistic associations that are tied in with big banks, the trusts, cartels, and syndicates spread themselves all across the planet, and they seize colonies for themselves. And governments team up with them, and these governments enforce them, and the world is redivided. The big monopolies redivide the world with war, and that's what World War I was. It was the redividing of the world by the big monopolies. Now, what did the rise of imperialism mean in terms of the world? Well, one example is the Philippines. The Philippines was originally a colony of Spain, and the United States seized it from Spain. And the people of the Philippines resisted, and hundreds of thousands of them were killed. The U.S. Marines occupied the Philippines and waged a war against the Filipino people for decades. And it was to keep the Philippines a colony of American corporations, keep it as a place that the American Navy could be put in order to ensure U.S. dominance in the Pacific, in order to make sure that the Philippines was a place that American products and exports could be dumped onto. That was imperialism. Imperialism was the British Empire going to India, people that had been weaving for thousands of years, and burning the looms and forcing the people of India to import their cloth from British corporations. We always hear about Gandhi, right? Mahatma Gandhi. What was Gandhi's great act of civil disobedience? What was it? What did Gandhi do over and over and over again to get himself arrested by the British Empire? What was his peaceful civil disobedience? Boiling salt water. Gandhi would light a fire, have a pot of water, and start boiling the water in the hopes that eventually the water would all evaporate and he could make his own salt. That was a crime in India, because in India, the people were required to buy their salt and other spices from the British corporations. And so by boiling his own salt, he was stealing from the British corporations who had a monopoly over India. There's many examples of imperialism in practice. And it doesn't have to be direct colonialism, directly taking control of the country. It's about controlling their economy, having a government that is subservient, and having the international corporations sink their fangs into it. There's many examples that one can lift. Belgium, right? Belgium was a colony of, Belgium colonized the Congo in Central Africa. And the Congo it was subjected to horrendous genocidal crimes in order to extract rubber, in order to just exterminate the population. It was millions of people that were worked to death in order to provide rubber for the Belgian corporations. There are many examples we could go over. For example, we talk about NAFTA, right? Mexico, people there have been growing their own food since before Christopher Columbus showed up. But now in Mexico, when people go to the store and buy food, they don't buy it from Mexican corporations or Mexican farmers. They buy it from American corporations. The Mexican farming sector was completely devastated by NAFTA. And now American food corporations dominate the Mexican food market. And the same for Haiti. The Haitian people have had farms that have been growing their own products, growing their own agricultural products for decades. But under Bill Clinton and under NAFTA, the people of Haiti lost their agricultural sector and they became a captive market. And now they're very, very impoverished. But those Haitians that are wealthy enough to go to the store and buy food, they buy the food from American corporations, American agribusiness. There's many examples of this. Imperialism is the export of capital. It is the corporations based in Western countries spreading themselves all over the world and extracting super profits by keeping sections of the world as captive markets, unable to control their own industries, unable to have control of their own raw materials and natural resources, becoming a place that the huge multinational corporations can dump their products onto. And imperialism does not simply exploit workers, it exploits entire nations. Nations are subjected to super exploitation in order to make super profits for the big multinational corporations. And when we talk about monopolistic capitalism, right, that a lot of times libertarians will say, well, this isn't real capitalism because there's no competition. These big corporations run it. That's monopolism. The dominance of the economy by a few corporations who are in bed with the government, and the government rigs the laws in order to make sure that they stay at the top, and then uses its military and its foreign policy apparatus to ensure that they gain dominance and keep sections of the world under their domination. This is imperialism. Capitalism in its monopolistic stage, the impoverishment of the world in order to enrich Wall Street and London, holding back development, preventing development. This is imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. A lot of people think imperialism is a synonym for invading another country. That is not the case. One country invades another country. That is colonialism. That is expansionism. But imperialism refers to an economic system. Because I frequently will get people who say, well, Caleb, Russia is imperialist, China is imperialist. No, they're not. This is not their economic system. You can argue that Russia did something bad here or there. You can argue that China did something bad. You can even argue that they have ambitions or they seek to have global influence or whatnot. But unless you can point to their economic system functioning in this way, you're not arguing that they're imperialism in the sense that I am arguing. A lot of times, it can be frustrating to argue with people because you're arguing about words when you have separate definitions of those words. Now, it's a big problem, right? If I think an orange and an apple are the same thing, and we have an argument about what a fruit is, we might agree on what the fruit is. We just have a different word for it. And that the way imperialism is defined nowadays is completely wrong by the left, by the right, by everybody. And we've gotten to the point in Center for Political Innovation that we try to avoid simply using the word imperialism. We talk about globalism / imperialism because that accurately expresses what we're for. If we just say imperialism, people get this Avatar Dances with Wolves image in their head. of, beautiful, noble savages who live on some island or live in some primitive place, who have no technology and dance around and are happy and free in nature. And then the evil tractor rolls in from the West and crushes their songs of peace. And that's not what imperialism is. And in fact, the main thing that people who break out of imperialism do is electrify and build and construct. Imperialism is not progress. Imperialism is about stopping progress. However, the left, since it's been dominated by forces, and we're going to get into that later, the left has come to believe that imperialism is a synonym for electrification. Imperialism is a synonym for economic development. It is not. It is the opposite of that. It is preventing electrification, preventing development, preventing construction. It is keeping countries in impoverished conditions. That's what imperialism is. So we can't just say imperialism, or people get this woke narrative in their head. It's an identity politics narrative. It is a noble savages narrative. Was it Voltaire or one of those French intellectuals who had the concept of the noble savage? Right? It is this weird white man's burden fantasy that people have of and it has nothing to do with economic realities. And so we don't just say imperialism because we're referring to an economic system. On the right, people say globalism, and they are referring to this system of globalism. However, if you just say globalism, you're not communicating what it's about. And people think, yes, it's these big bankers in the World Economic Forum who are actually Satanists and worship goats and drink their blood and are satanic pedophiles. And, what are they? They're satanic pedophiles, and they're all communists. And that's why we got to vote for Trump. And it's like they kind of know what you're talking about, right? The right are talking about globalism, and they mean big corporations that dominate the world, that corrupt the government. But they don't have an economic analysis. It's just kind of, they understand that the World Economic Forum and the International Monetary Fund and these big multinational bankers and corporations that fund a lot of environmental activism and fund a lot of the woke stuff, and they kind of understand they exist, but their explanation of why they are the way they are is not rooted in economics. It's rooted in some kind of sci-fi horror movie. And it's not to say that Jeffrey Epstein wasn't a real person. He was. It's not to say that conspiracies do not exist. It's not to say that these forces are not evil. Do they not assassinate people and carry out conspiracies among themselves? Of course. But if you just say globalism, people on the right know what you're talking about, but they don't have any understanding of it. So we say globalism / imperialism as a way of pointing to this economic understanding of a huge global economic system that holds back development and impoverishes people. And that's the Leninist understanding of a global economic system where banks and monopolistic finance capital, the export of capital, trusts, cartels, and syndicates, that's the Leninist understanding. However, before Lenin, there was a guy named Henry Charles Carey. And shout out to Noah. Noah pointed out to me Time magazine attacked Henry Charles Carey. Henry Charles Carey was the economic advisor to Abraham Lincoln. And Time magazine ranted and raved against him and blamed Trump's tariffs on him. And Time magazine did a stupid, ignorant hit piece on Henry Charles Carey. But Henry Charles Carey was an anti-slavery economist who opposed the practice of slavery and explained how slavery was a backward, primitive, barbaric, brutal thing that was propped up by the British Empire, and that it was the British financial system that was responsible for the preservation of chattel slavery in the U.S. South. And Time magazine tried to deny that that was the reality. They claimed it was a conspiracy theory that the British supported the slaveocracy of the South, which is absurd. It's very well documented. The British wanted to send their navy to break the blockade of the South. They wanted the cheap cotton. When we hear about slaves picking cotton, who were they picking it for? They were picking it to put it on ships and send it to London and Yorkshire so that the British textile industry, with which British imperialism was dominating the world, could have cheap cotton. The British Empire and the slaveocracy of the South were economically tied in with each other, and Wall Street was a stronghold of pro-slavery sentiments. Most of the North was anti-slavery, but Wall Street, New York, was pro-slavery. Why? Because Wall Street, right? Why was it called Wall Street? There was a giant wall and there was a giant slave market there at one point. But after slavery was abolished in the state of New York, slavery continued to be a huge source of economic strength for the finance houses of Wall Street. The finance houses of Wall Street insured those slave ships that were going to Britain, and they invested in the London Stock Exchange. And the insurance cartels and the financiers of Wall Street were heavily involved with this system. And Wall Street and London were very much key in propping up the slave system of the South. You would not have had slavery maintained in the South if it hadn't been for the economic support that was provided to slavery by the British Empire. And Henry Charles Carey knew this. And Henry Charles Carey wrote a very important pamphlet called A Harmony of Interests, where he called out the English system. That's what he called it. He called it the English system. And he talked about an economic system where the wealth of the world flows into one mighty city, where he talked about how in India they were underworking the Hindu and reducing the rest of the world down to his level. They talked about depopulation, and that dominating the world via a mighty navy, controlling the trade routes in order to enrich one mighty city, this was the English system. Henry Charles Carey argued against it, that there was the American system. And I should just read to you. I quote in the book that I wrote about the danger of an American years of lead. I quote what Henry Charles Carey wrote. The way he ended his very powerful pamphlet about the English system versus the American system. So I will just read it to you. I might as well, right? He wrote, "Two systems are before the world. One looks to exporting men to occupy desert tracts, the sovereignty of which is obtained by the aid of diplomacy or war. The other to increasing the value of an immense extent of vacant land by importing men by the millions for their occupation. One looks to the concentration of wealth and power in a great commercial city that shall rival the great cities of modern times, which have been and are being supported by aid of contributions, which have exhausted every nation subjected to them. The other to concentration, by aid of which markets shall be made upon the land for the products of the land, and the farmer and the planter to be enriched. One looks to increasing the necessity for commerce, the other to increasing the power to maintain it. One looks to underworking the Hindu and sinking the rest of the world to his level, the other to raising the standard of man throughout the world to our level. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism, the other to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action, and civilization. One looks toward universal war, the other toward universal peace. One is the English system, and the other we may be proud to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world." And he went on to say, to raise the value of labor throughout the world, we need only to raise the value of our own. To raise the value of land throughout the world, it is needed only that we adopt measures to raise the value of our own. To diffuse intelligence and promote the cause of morality throughout the world, we are required only to pursue the course that shall diffuse education throughout our own land, and shall enable every man to readily acquire property, and with it respect the rights of property. To improve the political condition of man throughout the world, it is needed that we ourselves should remain at peace and avoid taxation for the maintenance of fleets and armies, and become rich and prosperous. To raise the condition of women throughout the world, it is required of us only to pursue that course that enables men to remain at home and to get married, that they may surround themselves with happy children and grandchildren. To substitute true Christianity for the detestable system of Malthusianism, it is needed that we prove to the world that it is the population that makes food come out of the rich soils, and that food tends to increase more rapidly than population. To prove that among the people of the world, whether agriculturalists or manufacturers or merchants, there is perfect harmony of interests, and that the happiness of individuals, as well as the grandeur of nations, is to be promoted by perfect obedience to that greatest of all commands: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That was Henry Charles Carey. He said that before Vladimir Lenin. And he was describing how at the time, the United States was not fully monopolized, but Britain was, and that Britain was setting up a global system. And that system was supporting slavery and the slaveocracy of the South. And that the main difference was the question of mankind. Like Lenin was a Marxist. Lenin believed labor was the source of all wealth. And many of the popes, the Catholic Church, said labor is the source of all wealth. And Abraham Lincoln said that labor is the source of all wealth. And Henry Charles Carey said that Malthusianism was wrong, and it is human beings that are the source of wealth and make wealth and food come up from the soil. And that if we want a strong country, we must invest in the people, educate the people, create conditions where people can get married and have children, and where people can create their own business and develop, right? And that human beings are the source of all wealth. And that this notion that Henry Charles Carey had and this notion that Lenin had were essentially two sides of the same thing. They're pointing to a monopolistic system that holds back development, that is depopulating the world, creating fleets and armies, underworking the Hindu and reducing humanity down to his level to prop up a mighty city where entire nations are subjected. And Henry Charles Carey is describing the same thing. However, now there is a third explanation of this system that is, I wouldn't say it's new exactly, but it is new in its interpretation. And this is called geopolitics. In Russia and in China, right? They've been doing communism for 100 years now, right? They had the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union in Russia. They're not the Soviet Union anymore, but that's part of their heritage. They're very proud of it, despite its flaws. China is a communist country, right? It's led by the Communist Party. They've adjusted their ideology to be much more pro-growth. They've broken with the kind of extreme elements of Mao Zedong thought, and they've adopted Deng Xiaoping theory, and it's, Xi Jinping's interpretation. But China is a pro-growth government, socialism with Chinese characteristics. They've been doing the communist stuff for a long time. They understand Leninism. But recently, in Russia and in China, we've seen a lot of reflection on wider history. And there's a new school called geopolitics that argues that there are two types of civilization. There are civilizations of the land and civilizations of the sea. Thalassocracy is civilization of the sea, and tellerocracy is civilization of the land. And that it's a very subtle difference. But civilizations of the sea tend to be more individualistic, more militaristic, and they tend to hold back development in the nations that they colonize. Whereas civilizations and empires of the land, in order to stay intact, they must build roads and they must engage in development. That if you're building an empire on the sea, you have to hold back development and you just build a mighty navy to control the trade routes. If you're building an empire on the land, you have to build roads, you have to stabilize, you have to bring different ethnic groups together. And that as a result of geographic conditions, the empires that arose in Western Europe, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, American imperialism, as opposed to the Russian Empire of the Tsars, to the great Chinese civilization that goes back 5,000 years. They developed a different culture, a different way of being. And it's a subtle way of being, but in Asia, they're much more collectivist in the way they view things. They're much more long-term in the way they view things. In the West, we're much more individualistic in the way we view things. We're much more short-term and short-term gain oriented in how we view things. And that in the past, Marxists would say this difference was simply that the West was more advanced, right? Well, the West had capitalism first. The East still has feudalism. So it's just a matter of the West is more developed. But starting with Stalin, and especially in our time, they're now starting to say, well, no, right? The Chinese Communist Party says it is not opposed to traditional Chinese culture, only the aspects of traditional Chinese culture rooted in feudalism, right? But there are aspects of traditional Chinese culture that is not rooted in feudalism, that is just part of China's unique identity. Alexander Dugin, the Russian political thinker who I've had the honor of meeting, Alexander Dugin argued that communism became subjected to this spiritual divide, that Leon Trotsky, a Jew born in Kherson, studied in Odessa, and spent most of his life in America, in New York City, in London, in Vienna, and in Western cities, represented a continuation of the globalist outlook, the globalist Atlanticist outlook that one found in Marx and in the Western left and the tradition of the French Revolution. Whereas Stalin, a Georgian from a little rural village called Gori in Georgia, who studied at a Russian Orthodox seminary school to be a priest before adopting the Bolshevik perspective, Stalin, country Joe from the countryside, and Trotsky, the rich kid who hung out and liked to party and not tip at restaurants in New York City, London, and Vienna, they had a divergent interpretation of Marxism, and that Stalin represented socialism of the land, whereas Trotsky represented socialism of the sea. Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, his romanticization of violence, his desire to spread global chaos, that was the sea civilization reflecting itself in an interpretation of communism. Whereas Stalin and his belief in socialism in one country and his belief in loyalty to the country and community and we will come together as a people, and his kind of spiritual bond and connection with the Russian people and their struggle to hold on to their land and build themselves up and develop, that even though Stalin was an atheist and even though he was a Marxist, just like Trotsky, his interpretation of Marxism was an Eastern interpretation of Marxism, and it was a socialism of the land, a telerocratic socialism, right? That thalassocracy and civilization of the sea produces one mindset, talarocracy produces another mindset. This is the way they're talking in Russia and in China now. And I think, again, this is just another side of the same coin. And that there was a time in my life where, again, I would have just taken what Lenin said and pounded the table with it. And I am beyond that point, right? I'm supposed to talk to Chris Coutrone on Saturday. I'm supposed to have a conversation with the platypus guy. We'll see. I'm looking forward to it if it happens. I've listened to some of his conversations that he's had with other people. And, a lot of the people who CPI was close to in the past, or, we still agree with them. And we're not enemies, but they maintain this dogmatism, right? This idea that if we just go back to the pure Stalin interpretation of Marxism, Leninism, we have all the answers. And I would argue that is one, that interpretation has some of the picture. It understands imperialism. It understands why Trotskyism is wrong. It understands how the Soviet Union was able to develop and build itself up, but it's missing part of the picture. It's one side of the story. There's also Henry Charles Carey. There's also geopolitics, right? And that with all of this, we can understand what we are up against. What are we up against? We are up against an international financial system in which big banks and corporations dominate the world and keep the world poor in order to maintain their dominance, and have become addicted to war. War is a necessity to maintain their system. They can't stop having wars because starting in the 20th century, country after country after country started breaking out of their dominance, and now their system is in crisis. It cannot handle technological advancement and the breakthroughs of technology, that human beings are more productive than ever before, and that should be a good thing. But their satanic international system that puts money over people cannot handle human beings' creative power. And so in order to maintain their system, they must have endless war, endless destruction, and they must try to keep humanity down, and that they are now at war with the essence of what it means to be human. They are at war with innovation. They are at war with human progress. They are openly discussing depopulation, obsessively discussing depopulation, and they have catastrophic images of where humanity will go. And all of this is rooted in the fact that their economic order, whether it's Atlanticism, the British Empire, the English system, imperialism, globalism, imperialism, that system is outmoded and it cannot continue. And humanity is marching ahead beyond them. And so in their desperation, they are trying to suppress humanity itself. Now, all of that I just laid out, that's not simple stuff. It's not simple stuff. It's complicated, as they say. And that brings me to a question that actually inspired this stream. So the person who left the comment, thank you. Somebody who's a harsh critic of this channel and doesn't like me and watches these streams. They don't really listen. They just listen for something they can write below in the comments to, say something about. I get that every so often for years. I mean, this happened 10, 15 years ago. I believe this channel is 17 years old total. And 17 years ago, somebody was doing this, right? But people who are like afraid they might agree with me watch my content, and they watch and they watch and they wait until I say something they disagree with, and they go, aha, see, I knew he was a son of a bitch. And then they leave the comment and they stop the video. People have been doing that for years, right? It's like people that are questioning their own worldview and terrified they might start to agree with me. That's something people do, and it's not just with this channel; it's with many channels, right? It's something people do is when people are insecure in their own perspective, number one, but they really don't want to agree with me or somebody else. They will start to watch that somebody else until they find something they disagree with, and they'll leave a comment. There's one of these people who's been doing that on this channel, right? It's the latest. People have been doing that for years. The latest guy to be doing that. I said something about Malthusianism. And he left a comment, oh, you're so stupid. Why are you always talking about Malthusianism? There's no Malthusians around. You're a conspiracy theorist and blah, 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 blah. Well, he's not the first person to have said that, right? Jason Unruhe, I believe he said at one point, he said, Caleb, where are all these Malthusians you're always talking about? Are they in the room right now? Right? He's trying to be funny. The thing is, Malthusianism is almost the official religion of the Western world. And some people hear that and they find that to be shocking. They say, how can you say that, Caleb? Everyone agrees Malthus was a racist. The British economist Robert Thomas Malthus was a racist. No one's talking about forcibly, eugenics and breeding out the brown people of the world. So that's bullshit. Well, no. Malthusianism is not simply racism. A lot of racism flows from Malthusianism. Malthusianism is not simply, the idea of committing genocide or whatever. Malthusianism is an economic theory, and it is the primary economic theory of the British Empire, and it has been for a long time. And I mean, it started in the late 1700s. There was a British economist who wrote a text called The Principle of Population, where he argued that the French Revolution was caused by overpopulation. And he was pointing to an aspect of feudalism that was kind of true, right? Is that feudalism is a system where, you can't really expand to a higher level of development. And feudalism does have an issue with the fact that, people breed faster than the feudal system can produce food. So he was pointing to something true about feudalism. And then he projected that onto all of human history. And he said, oh, the problems of the world are due to a term he invented called overpopulation. Now, he was talking about feudalism and the French Revolution. He's saying, why are all these people dying in the French Revolution? He said, oh, that's because there were too many people in France. The French feudal system couldn't feed them all. And then he proposed measures to keep the population low to prevent things like the French Revolution from ever happening. It was pretty awful. And it wasn't acknowledging that the French feudal system was very awful. It was just, French feudalism was fine. It's just there were too many people. So if we just artificially keep the population low, things like the French Revolution will never happen. Well, he was missing a key reality, which was that France was still a feudal country at that time. Britain, where he was living, had been through the English Civil War and had adopted the capitalist system. Right. And that capitalism and feudalism are very different from each other. And he didn't even really acknowledge the difference between capitalism and feudalism. He just said, look, sometimes the population gets too high, and that's a problem. So he proposed in this essay very repugnant efforts to court the return of the plague in order to keep poor people down, all kinds of things to do to keep low-income people from reproducing. That's what he argued. Now, that was Robert Malthus and this concept of overpopulation. Then, I think maybe almost a century later, you have Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin was a follower of Malthus. He was a Malthusian because that was the primary view among British rich people, is that there's too many people in the world. And if the poor people breed too much, that's a problem. And that if there's too many poor people, they'll revolt. And you started at this point to see capitalist crises of overproduction. So Charles Darwin came along and he came up with his understanding of biology, which, it was the beginning of understanding evolutionary biology. And you can argue, I'm not here to argue science with anybody. I think that a lot of his science was genuinely correct, but he presented it with a bias, right? He himself was a British Empire Malthusian and a racist. And that the way he presented his theories, almost immediately, you got this term survival of the fittest, right? Which I guess some people say Charles Darwin never actually used the term survival of the fittest, but survival of the fittest. Darwin argued that some species are more likely to reproduce than others because they have some kind of trait that is winning. But immediately the phrase survival of the fittest became adopted by the British Empire. And they argued that in the name of modern science, some races are superior to others, and that the problems of the world are when the unfit are allowed to breed. And that's what they argued. Now, that's not what Darwin argued. Darwin said fitness, according to Charles Darwin, is your ability to produce fertile offspring. Right? That's all it is. So as long as you can produce fertile offspring, you are fit. And those who are the most fit are those who produce the most fertile offspring. Now, that's not what the British Empire meant. They meant the best, right? And this concept of natural selection that came from Darwin, it immediately got adopted by the British Empire as a propaganda tool. And it was the Rockefeller family, the wealthy oil banking family in America. They launched an institution called the Neo-Malthusian Society. And the Neo-Malthusian Society took Robert Malthus's concept of overpopulation and social Darwinism, this kind of British Empire racist supremacist interpretation of human, of human society, and combined them into kind of a new synthesis that was at the time called Neo-Malthusianism. And Neo-Malthusianism argued that the problems of capitalism were caused by overpopulation, and that in the name of the good of society, poor people needed to be exterminated. That's what they believed, that the problems, capitalism was breaking down because People were homeless because there were too many houses. People were hungry because there was too much food. And the neo-Malthusian society said the way to resolve this problem is to exterminate poor people. And that was the neo-Malthusian society funded by the Rockefeller family. What was going on is that starting in 1825, every few years, the capitalist system broke down in a crisis of overproduction or a value crisis. And, we'll show this film. I can't show it enough times because this concept is important to understand. Human labor is the source of all wealth. Machines reduce the role of human labor in technology. As a result, workers cannot buy the products that they are producing. More products are produced, and the market becomes glutted with products that cannot be sold. Explain what needs to be explained, what used to be considered Marxism 101, about why it is that our Western capitalist economy is crashing and burning. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to do some math. And I hate math. Do you know why I hate math? Because I grew up in America. I went to public school in the United States of America, so I am going to, at risk of embarrassing myself, because math was never my best subject, I am going to do some mathematics here on the board for you to explain the problem.
We very much enjoyed Caleb's speech.
So if you are creating a product, right, if you're a factory owner, you're making a product, you are going to need the material through which that product is made, the manufacturing materials. So that'll be A.
The simple equation you put forward to explain the crisis of overproduction and the falling rate of profit.
And you're probably going to need to transport the product to where it's sold. That's B.
It broke down where your money goes.
You're also going to have to pay your labor costs. Labor costs are represented by C.
Explanations of those concepts that people are able to understand.
Then when consumers purchase the product, they're going to pay a final price. And that final price is D. However, there's a problem with that.
I like the fact that he framed it that way to make it very clear.
Which is that the capitalist can't change how much A costs. He can't change how much B costs. So the profit of the capitalist can only be extracted from the value put into it by the worker. And this is the basis of Marxism, the understanding of surplus value.
I've never seen it explained so simply anywhere. I've never been able to explain it that simply.
So C, the labor value, is divided. You have C1, which is what the worker actually gets paid. And then you have C2, which is the profit that the capitalist makes. And it all adds up to D, which is the final cost of the product. Now, the way people in the United States who talk about Marxism generally talk about this is they say, well, this is unfair. They say the worker is not getting paid the full value of his labor. But they're missing one of the most important points, which is not just that it's unfair and then people argue, well, what about the employer? He put up the money, doesn't he deserve to be? That's all a distraction. Because the important thing to understand is this. C1 is always going to be less than D. The wages paid out to the worker are never enough to buy back the product that he produces. There is always more products created than there are wages paid out to the worker. And this is the built-in problem of capitalism, the problem of overproduction. And it is always there in the capitalist economy. It never goes away. And they have invented all kinds of crazy mechanisms to try and deal with the problem of overproduction. Part of the reason that the US government has purchased billions and billions of dollars worth of cheese only to bury it in a cave in Springfield, Missouri, is to deal with this problem. It is an ongoing present problem, and it's a problem acknowledged by most capitalist economists. John Maynard Keynes said the problem was underconsumption rather than overproduction, but he was pointing to the same problem. The military-industrial complex in the United States is an effort to deal with this problem, to keep spending going. There's all kinds of mechanisms that they've invented to try and resolve this problem, but it gets worse. What is the capitalist always trying to do? He wants to maximize the amount of profit he makes. And one of the main ways they do that is with what's called labor-saving technology. Get rid of workers and replace workers with machines. As they eliminate workers from the process of production, as there's fewer and fewer workers involved, as machines take the place of workers, the role of C in production decreases. There's a little bit of a problem with that. As C goes down, C2 also goes down. right? As C decreases, C2 also decreases. And as the role of the worker in production is reduced, the rate of profit that the capitalist makes goes down. And this is called the tendency of the falling rate of profit. Only human labor creates value. And this is something that Adam Smith acknowledged. This is something some of the popes even acknowledge. Human labor creates all value. And so when you reduce the role of human labor in production, the amount of value created decreases, and the ability of the capitalist to extract surplus value also decreases. So this causes the capitalist to have to churn out even more products because he's making less and less of a profit on the overall product. He's making less and less of a percentage, so he has to churn them out. So this problem of the worker never being able to buy back what he produces and more products being created than are necessary, this problem becomes exacerbated. That is what you need to understand. We have a highly irrational system, and the more wealth that is produced, the sooner the market becomes saturated with products that cannot be sold, and you have unemployment. And the more efficient production becomes, the poorer everyone gets. Self-driving cars would be a curse over this economy. The U.S. government spends billions of dollars on buying agricultural products and burying them in order to keep the price high enough. And this is the problem with the capitalist mode of production. This is what Marx spent all his time writing about. All these people call themselves Marxists these days, and they don't know what the fuck they're talking about, right? They're talking about, oh, the worker and the employer, it's unfair. You know, they're talking about, oh, we need people to have the more equal money and income redistribution, income inequality. They're missing the point. This is the Communist Manifesto. This is what Karl Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Society finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a war of universal devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of substance. Industry and commerce have been destroyed. Why? Because there's too much civilization, too much means of substance, too much industry, and too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of bourgeois property. And he then goes on. And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces. On the other, by the conquest of new markets and the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby these crises are prevented. And this understanding, this is what I am really thankful for. Barely any Marxists still talk about this, but this is what we're living in our high-tech economy that is crashing and burning right now. It's because of this. We should be living in a world where there is more wealth and abundance than ever before, except we're living in a world with rising poverty and instability because we have an irrational economic system where abundance and technological advancement leads to a falling rate of profit and unemployment, and workers cannot buy back what they produce. And I have in the past said, thank goodness I was educated by these three books, right? High Tech, Low Pay by Sam Marcy, Low Wage Capitalism by Fred Goldstein, and The Future is Up to Us by Nelson Peary. And Penny, I believe, is making her way through High Tech, Low Pay by Sam Marcy. And I believe this quote, this is a quote she highlighted recently in our chat from this book. She highlighted, in the era of imperialism and the scientific technological revolution, each round of new technological innovation by the ruling class makes it more and more difficult to start the capitalist system up again after a bust. The two most important reasons are that technology reduces the skills and buying power of the workers, while at the same time increasing the productivity, thus ensuring that production saturates the markets at a faster and faster rate. Boom. Boom. That's what we're dealing with. And you are really lucky that you are watching this right now, because there's a lot of clowns out there calling themselves Marxists, calling themselves economists. None of them will ever tell you this. I don't know why. You go to China, they understand this. They talk about it all the time. You go to India, you go to communist groups in India, they talk about it all the time. You know, Jyoti Brar in Britain, she talks about this kind of thing. The Workers' Party of Belgium talks about it. But none of the clowns who get paraded around in America talking about Marxism talk about this, right? They talk about, oh, there's this pencil factory, but the workers, the workers, they don't get to keep the pencils that they produce in the pencil factory. It is unfair that the worker does not able to buy back the product. He does not get a share of the profits. It's very unfair. And as a result of this, there's income inequality, and that some people have more money than other workers. And this is income inequality. And that's why the government should give us a free health care. This is dialectical and Marxist-Leninist, and this is the concentration of the contradictory dialectic of the pseudo-syllogism of the epoch. And I understand a bunch of big philosophical words, and I talk with big, thick accents, so I must be smart. And my audience is full of people wearing berets, so I am very, very intelligent man who understand their philosophy. See, and I am a Marxist. And so because I am not teaching you anything, you must listen to me because I am so brilliant. Yes. And there's a bunch of them. I mean, I could list all the names I'm making fun of there. I'm conflating about 15 different ones of these clowns. None of them can tell you this. Boom. This is what it's all about, right? It's, and the other shit that people say is not helpful, honestly. Right. I can get to that in a minute. But the problem is that we have an economic system that cannot handle technological innovation. And technological innovation is the nature of mankind. So the only way they can restart their system is with mass destruction. Malthusianism. Right? Obviously, the answer can't be that we rationally organize the means of production. The answer is that we just need to engage in mass destruction. What does, again, the Communist Manifesto that I guess these people don't read because, they're talking about income inequality and they're talking about all this shit that has nothing to do with it. What does the Communist Manifesto say? What does the section on overproduction end with? How do they get over the crises? Enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces. Enforced destruction of the mass of productive forces. What's that? It's called degrowth. Degrowth, my friends. Degrowth. On the other, by conquest of new markets. Conquest of new markets. What's that called? War. War. But there's a problem with both degrowth and war, because that is to say, paving the way for a more extensive and more destructive crises, and diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. Every time they fix a crisis with war, every time they fix the crisis with degrowth and destruction of productive forces, it gets even harder to solve the next crisis. That is the problem with their system. And Malthusianism, the idea that there are too many people in the world, is how they can reboot their system. Mass destruction. World War II led to the post-World War II economic expansion. That's what it led to, the post-World War II economic expansion. And for, 20, 30 years, the economy was growing again because they blew up half the world and millions of people, hundreds of millions of people died. Pretty awful, but, the economy kept going, right? And that's what Malthusianism is. And they do it now in the name of ecology. I am not one to say that environmentalism is all fake. I'm not even one to say that there's not truth in global warming. I am one to point at the prevailing trends of environmentalism and say fraud. Why? because the solutions put forward by the environmental movement are never technological advancement. In fact, they're the opposite. They are degrowth, reducing consumption, and reducing the population, always. Originally, back in the 70s, you know who the biggest supporters of nuclear power were? Environmentalists, because they saw that burning fossil fuels was bad for the environment. But then, big oil companies started writing checks to environmentalists, and then they figured out that, oh boy, that nuclear power was the biggest threat that there ever was. And big oil started funding protest movements against nuclear energy because nuclear energy threatened to put fossil fuels out of business. And right now, China is at the center of fusion energy research. And do environmentalists go around saying, yay, China, China's going to solve fusion energy, and then we're going to not have this problem with fossil fuels? No, environmentalists go around protesting China and saying China's bad for the environment. I'm telling you that the issue is not people wanting us to have a more sustainable and strategic relationship with natural resources. There's nothing wrong with that, right? The Clean Air Act was good for the country, I think. I don't think, the Cuyahoga River catching on fire and, whatever, right? I'm not opposed to environmentalism as a concept. And, is it possible that human productivity is contributing to climate change? Absolutely, it's possible. I'm not ruling that out. But the solution of all the environmental groups is depopulation. Depopulation, reducing economic growth, reducing consumption. It's anti-growth. Well, anti-growth is Malthusianism. And that's what people say, well, there's no Malthusians around. There is. Anyone who says that overpopulation is reality is a Malthusian, because overpopulation is not true. This planet can handle thousands of times more human beings than we currently have. And the notion that there is just, there was a book published called The Limits to Growth. It was like the environmental manifesto of the 1970s, published by the Club of Rome. And in that book, they said, we're going to run out of oil by 1990. And we're going to run out of copper and steel. We're just going to run out of everything. And if humanity was still extracting oil the way we were in 1970, that would be true. Except we invented deep sea drilling. We invented hydraulic fracking. We invented, we invented all kinds of new mechanisms to extract oil. And now we got oil for quite a long time. And there's many, many other examples of this, of like, yes, if human beings didn't change our relationship with our environment, if we were stagnant in the way we operated, yes, we would have run out of resources. But we constantly change how we use resources. We constantly go to higher energy sources. We constantly go to higher levels. If we were still burning wood, we would have deforested the planet hundreds of years ago. Except we don't. Except we started burning coal, and now we have electrical heat, and that we move toward higher sources. But this notion that man is inherently the problem, right? That is at the center of the Malthusian worldview. Humans are just a problem. Humans need to breed less. They need to consume less. That they are what the term is, non-productive consumers, right? That's what Marx, when in his critique, Karl Marx hated Malthusianism, by the way. Theories of Surplus Value, right? This book Marx wrote, and he spends pages and pages going over this. And he says the only way Malthusianism can be correct is that if you assume that a big chunk of the population are non-productive consumers. Non-productive consumers. Well, Marx knew that that's not the case, because human labor power and human creativity is the source of wealth. So no, human beings are what creates wealth. They're not non-productive consumers, right? Non-productive consumers eventually became useless eaters, right? And this is the ideology of our Western world. It is the prevailing ideology of the West. Too many people in the world, they're non-productive consumers. We're going to run out of resources, so we have to depopulate, and we have to have constant war against countries that are developing and raising people up, right? Ibrahim Traore, the great African leader who's raising up his people and building, fisheries and building an agricultural boom and all of that. Well, he's a dictator. He's got to be gotten rid of. And China China can't be building power plants across the African continent, and the Belt and Road Initiative, and Russia's doing with the Eurasian Economic Union. Oh, we got to stop it. That's Malthusianism. That's Malthusianism. That is Malthusianism. Anyone who tells you that economic growth is somehow bad, not that it needs to be done more sustainably, not that it needs to be more equitable. No. Anyone who tells you that growth itself is bad, anyone who tells you there are too many people in the world and that human beings are themselves the problem, they are a Malthusian. So that's everywhere. That is the official religion of the Western world. It is assumed, right? It is a fact. It is considered irrefutable knowledge. Everybody knows there's just too many people. There's just too many people in the world. Bullshit. Bullshit. Everybody knows that we're going to run out of resources. Bullshit. Bullshit. Everybody knows that economic growth is just not a good thing and we got to stop growing. Bullshit. And the reason that we call ourselves innovationists, and the reason we don't call ourselves communists, is this is now what communists believe. Karl Marx wrote a whole book opposing all of this. Lenin came up with a whole theory called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, explaining why this bullshit is out there and how they conquer countries. But now the majority of people walking around calling themselves communists are Malthusians. This is a fact, right? The majority of people who call themselves communists think growth is bad. Degrowth socialism, Jason Hickel and all of them, growth is bad. Michael Moore, he was justifying his film Planet of the Humans. And he said the problem with capitalism is they just want more. They just grow and grow and grow. No. The problem with capitalism is it can't grow because we can't buy back what we produce. That's the problem, right? If capitalism could just grow and grow and grow, that would be awesome. But they can't. They can't. And in fact, the more they grow, the poorer people get. That's the problem, right? No, and that you go to any DSA meeting, you go to any meeting of DSA, you read any article in Jacobin, you listen to Mamdani, you listen to any of them. The problem is growth. Growth. Capitalism makes people want to have more stuff and they just want more. And that's somehow bad. And, and that what we need taxation and government control to disincentivize growth. That's what they believe. They believe that, social democracy, the idea of the welfare state, but they openly talk about, they don't just want a welfare state so people can be taken care of. They want a welfare state to disincentivize growth. Right? What is the slogan of our new mayor in New York City? What is the slogan? I don't know whether to be happy or to be sad. I just, whatever, what is the slogan of Mamdani? What slogan did he use to get elected? I've got a picture of it somewhere. Here, I'll find another picture of it to put on the screen. What was the slogan? All right, here we go. Here's the slogan that Mamdani used for his supposedly socialist movement. And again, if you want to get mad at me and tell me, well, Caleb, that's not degrowth. Yeah, it is actually, right? And I just look. He might be a great mayor. He might do amazing things. Who am I to say that? I may have voted for him. I may not have. Also, I'm not telling how I voted. But, I'm not saying he's the Antichrist. I'm just saying that the slogan that he used for his campaign, here, I got to export it. All right, here we go. The slogan that he used for his campaign was not a good one. It was not a good slogan. A city we can afford. That's a shitty slogan, right? New York City is, since the pandemic, we've kind of downgraded. Right? I'd say New York City is at Walmart and Kmart level at this point, right? This isn't shopping at Macy's anymore, right? This is not Fifth Avenue anymore. New York City is about Walmart and Kmart level. He wants us to be the 99-cent store, right? He wants us to be Dollar Tree. And that slogan, you say, well, what's wrong with that, Caleb? Well, I'll tell you what's wrong with that. The problem isn't that the city is too expensive. The problem is that we're not getting wealthy enough. We're not being invested in. Human labor power is the source of all wealth. And with all the wealth in this city, it would be very easy to have brilliant kids turned out in the school, to have brilliant businesses and tech startups being funded. It would be very easy to, build an amazing infrastructure system, build a public transportation system, and hire the China Railway Corporation to build it and have beautiful trains and subways. The problem isn't that we can't afford it. The problem is that, the problem isn't that the city is too expensive. The problem is that we can't afford it because they're not investing in us. We're not wealthy enough. That's the problem. It's not that we can't afford it. It's that we're not wealthy enough. When it comes to rent, with rent, that's true, right? Rent is too damn high, and that is, the inflation from real estate speculation. But other than the rent, the issue is that our people here in New York City are not invested in. They're not providing young people with decent education. They're not paving the roads. They are letting the public transportation system fall to shit, right? They are not paying good wages to the workers on the job, right? And we're not investing in physical economy. The problem is not that we just need to make the city cheaper. The problem is that we need the people of this city to be wealthier, right? And that's the issue. Wealth isn't bad. Wealth is not bad. Exploitation is bad. Impoverishing other people to make wealth is bad, but wealth is not bad, right? And the idea that wealth is bad, it is the Malthusian mindset. The idea that humans are bad, and there's too many of them. Human consumption and human productivity needs to be slowed down. It accompanies a whole mindset prior to the 1960s and the CIA funding of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. In America, art that was left-wing and socialist was beautiful murals of working people. If you read my book, The Danger of an American Years of Lead, I actually have pictures in here, right? This is the mural of the Labor Union Hall in Hawaii of workers, Hawaiian workers going out on strike. This is the monument in Senegal to independence, the monument of African Renaissance built by North Korea in the nation of Senegal. A beautiful, beautiful African father and wife and their child pointing toward the future. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. That's called social realism. And that used to be the kind of art that was associated with the left, with communism and socialism and radicals. This is the Soviet Union, that their beautiful, beautiful monument of the worker and the peasant woman. There's so many examples. That's what used to be left wing, right? This is a mural. This is in the Kansas State Capitol building. John Brown with a Bible and a rifle fighting for the freedom of the black people. Beautiful, right? This was a social realist painting put up by Roosevelt in the Kansas State Capitol building with the WPA, right? That's what being a leftist used to be associated with. That's what left-wing art used to be associated with. What did they replace it with? Jackson Pollock, abstract art. And who paid for it? The Rockefellers. The Museum of Modern Art in New York City. They used to call it Mom's Museum. That's what the Rockefeller kids called it, because it was Mrs. Rockefeller's little project. She had an art museum that glorified art, that was paint splattered on a canvas, that was pornographic, that was violent, that was human feces, art that degraded people. And if you read, they openly talk about this shit, right? It wasn't just the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom. It was the Rockefellers, and they talked about why they liked abstract art. I mean, it's crazy. I'll read you what they wrote about why they liked it. This is from Nancy Hills, an artist who's a big advocate for Jackson Pollock. She writes, "I believe ugly paintings threaten us. because they're unfamiliar, unruly, and emerge unbidden without our consent. They subvert our need for control. It's like experiencing a mutation causing unforeseeable consequences. They're unpredictable, unfamiliar, unrecognizable, and different than our recent work. Right? She's basically saying, rather than having art that makes you feel powerful, makes you proud of who you are. Look at this beautiful, again, this is the painting. This is the monument to African Renaissance that North Korea, they're not Africans in North Korea, they're Asians, but to celebrate the African people and their struggle against imperialism. And they built this beautiful monument celebrating the African people, rather than art that makes you feel confident and proud and optimistic, right? What have they got? They've got art that subverts your need for control, makes you feel unbidden without your consent, threatens you. Basically, art that makes you feel like you're being molested. That's basically what Nancy is saying. Art that makes you feel like someone's touching you inappropriately, right? Makes you feel like you shouldn't have control. You shouldn't be proud of who you are. You don't have control. It shifts your consciousness. Right? Art that makes you feel gross, weak. Right? They're very open about this. This is psychological warfare. Right? The Rockefeller think tanks, the CIA's promoting of drugs and Project MK Ultra, the replacement of heroic social realist art with modern art, and openly seeking art that makes you feel less confident, that makes you feel threatened, that makes you feel like someone's touching you without your consent. Right? Art that makes you feel threatened. Right? This is psychological warfare. It reinforces their conception that humanity is the problem, that humanity is bad. And that's Malthusianism. And again, we're connecting things that don't seem like they're on the surface, they're connected. I told you about imperialism and the crisis of capitalism, and how they need to destroy productive forces. I told you about the theory of overpopulation. I told you about the Congress for Cultural Freedom and art, and it's all connected. It's all connected. And I'm telling you that the British Empire system, the British Empire that believes in free trade and free markets, and survival of the fittest, and natural selection, and overpopulation, and Malthusianism, and contempt for humanity, the British Empire system that needs relentless war, that is the threat to humanity. And that a big chunk of the world has broken free from that system. And that ultimately America must break free from that system too, and that the best times in our history, the Second World War, where we stood with Russia against fascism, the American Revolution, the Civil War, where we defeated the slaveocracy that was being propped up by the British Empire, not a conspiracy theory. The best moments in our history have been when we have rejected the British Empire system and stood with the people of the world and struggling to break free from it. And that is what innovationism is all about. Celebrating humanity. Rejecting the nihilism and pessimism that serves the economic needs and the ideology created to back up those economic needs of the big monopolies and the international financial oligarchy. That's what we're talking about. Look, I wrote a book about Kamala Harris during the pandemic. And my book, got a review in a newspaper in India, got a review in the British Communist newspaper in the United Kingdom. I guess it made a little bit of a splash, but it wasn't a huge deal. But then the day that Kamala Harris became the nominee of the Democrat Party in the 2024 election, Amazon banned this book. They banned it the very day she became the nominee. They did not want anyone to see this book. And Jimmy Dore was mad about it. Max Blumenthal was mad about it. Kim Iverson was mad about it. InfoWars, Alex Jones was mad about it. And this book exploded in popularity, and thousands of copies were sold. At least 3,000 copies of this book sold after they banned it, because people wanted to know what was in this book. And in this book, I said that Kamala Harris is an expression of the pessimistic, hopeless, anti-human mentality that our leaders are promoting. And I contrasted Kamala Harris with Stalin and with the Soviet Union and with the BRICS countries and then everything that's going on. And so I'm just going to quickly show you, all right, just a little summary of my book on Kamala Harris, the book that they banned during the election cycle, the book that made me more famous than anything else I've written, and I'm just going to show you a clip from it, and then we'll do the roll call and I'll answer some questions. But you got to understand everything I talked about Malthusianism, about the British Empire system, about the Center for Political Innovation, about all of this. It's all connected. And that if you just have one piece of the puzzle, and if you just open a Marxist textbook and memorize stuff like that, you're going to miss. They're all pieces of a bigger picture, a bigger puzzle. And innovationism, our ideology, our new understanding is a new synthesis, a new breakthrough that is going to lead us to build the movement to save our country from the nightmare of imperialism. So here we go.
It's bizarre. She's trying to frame herself as Miss Black Lives Matter, when in reality, Kamala Harris was the queen of mass incarceration.
Kevin Cooper was hours away from receiving lethal injection. Hours away from it. His lawyers asked that DNA evidence be acquired in order to make sure he was actually guilty of the crime. And Kamala Harris's office tried to prevent DNA evidence from being acquired. They wanted Kevin Cooper to be executed, but the governor of California disagreed. They acquired DNA evidence, and the execution was stopped. The New York Times tells us that she feels really bad about it, for whatever that means. And people can also recall that while she was head of the California State Attorney General's office, over 1,000 people were locked up for smoking marijuana. She presided over jailing a lot of people. And on top of that, the drug labs in the state of California that were being used by the police were turning up false positive results. And yet, Kamala Harris's office did not tell the defense attorneys or the judges about this. They knew that the drug labs were turning over false positives, and people went to prison because her office concealed that their drug labs were turning up false positives. And another thing about Kamala Harris, I don't know if people saw, but there's a video of Kamala Harris where she's bragging about how she jailed the parents of children who were truant from school.
I would not be standing here were it not for the education I received. And I know many of us will say the same thing. And I believe a child going without an education is tantamount to a crime. So I decided I was going to start prosecuting parents for truancy. Well, this was a little controversial in San Francisco. And frankly, my staff went bananas. They were very concerned because we didn't know at the time whether I was going to have an opponent in my re-election race. But I said, look, I'm done. This is a serious issue, and I've got a little political capital, and I'm going to spend some of it.
Have you seen the clip? And she gets up there, and it's the same kind of thing. She's giggling. Yes, I had the idea that we could lock up parents who are truant from school. You know, I wouldn't be anywhere in my life if it weren't for my education, and so not giving a child their education is a crime, and so I jailed parents, and she's giggling about it. It's just so great. And, you know, I see so much in U.S. media. They like to trivialize incarceration. There's so many shows on Netflix and all of that where it ends towards the end where someone goes to jail, but it's part of the happy ending. It's okay. And they don't seem to realize what that means. You know, when one member of a family, when a father or a mother goes to prison, or a brother or a sister, it hurts the entire family. And when Kamala Harris is up there giggling about, I locked up these parents because their kids weren't in school. Yeah, kids need to be in school. If kids aren't getting to school, it's a problem. But the worst thing you could do is then throw their parents in jail. That's not going to help the situation in any conceivable way. But when she's joking about it, and she's laughing about it, Kamala Harris, she says, what did she say? She said, well, I wouldn't be anywhere if it wasn't for my education. It's about her. The big line when she was calling out Joe Biden, when she was trying to contend with Joe Biden in the presidential election, what did she shout at Joe Biden? She shouted, that little girl was me.
You know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
And then her campaign started churning out T-shirts with the face of 10-year-old Kamala Harris on them. Do you remember this? Yes. It's almost like she wants us to vote for her because she was once a 10-year-old child. I mean, that's what it sounds like. What's particularly interesting is, you remember when Barack Obama was running for president. We knew everything about Barack Obama. We knew all about Barack Obama's pastor. We knew about Barack Obama's father from Kenya. We knew the school he went to in Indonesia. But Kamala Harris, barely anybody knows anything about Kamala Harris. Well, Kamala Harris's mother, who's now deceased, was from India, was a cancer researcher. And Kamala Harris's father, Donald Harris, was a Marxist economist and is a Marxist economist, a professor at Stanford University. He was an advisor to the government of Michael Manley in Jamaica, and he and Kamala are estranged from one another. He did not attend Kamala's inauguration as vice president. They're not on good speaking terms. But the more you look at it, it's very clear that Kamala Harris sees herself as a victim. The way Kamala Harris speaks, the world has been unfair to her. And she blames Donald Harris for that to some degree or other. We don't know why. We also, there's rumors, we don't really know what happened when she was in Quebec. We just know she never talks about the years that she spent in Quebec. But Kamala Harris thinks that she is a victim. And she wants the whole world to know that that little girl was her. And she wants vengeance. And she wants to make people pay. And she wanted to make Kevin Cooper pay. And she wanted to make those parents pay. That's what leftism is if it's stripped of economics, if it's stripped of class struggle, if it's stripped of a desire to have the people rise up and control the means of production, if it's just anger, if it's just revenge, it's just a call for destruction, a call for rebellion, that's what Kamala Harris is. Kamala Harris, she's very much a guillotine meme. That's what she is. It's the glorification of punishment, a desire for revenge, a desire for destruction. And that if you look at the history of socialism around the world, the strength of socialism wasn't the guillotines, it wasn't the firing squads, it wasn't the persecution. That's not what people remember the strength of socialism being. They just did a poll. 75% of Russians say that the Soviet Union was the best time in their history, but they're not thinking that because of executions. This was from a PBS documentary. They interviewed a woman named Tatiana Fedorova.
Stalin set a task. Build this or build that. And thanks to the fact that people trusted him and this enthusiasm of young people, it was possible. Remember, this was a country where people were illiterate, lived in virtual darkness, wore birch bark shoes. Even now, I think it's like something out of a fairy tale. How was it possible at one of the most difficult times to raise these great construction sites? It was only possible through the unity of the people and the love of the people for their idol.
And the reason Stalin remains wildly popular in Russia, it's not because he executed people, it's because he mobilized them to build that country up from nothing. This was a country... He built some of the world's largest power plants, he wiped out illiteracy, and he built a modern industrial country. He raised millions of people up out of poverty. And then they fought off the Nazi invaders, and then they rebuilt the country again, and a few years later they were the first country in outer space. And the strength of socialism was not that it punished people and that it persecuted people, but rather that it enabled people to go out and build and construct. I've said to many people, I'm not a socialist because I want to destroy America. I'm a socialist because I want to save America. And we have to save America from the horrors that are being unfolded by an irrational system where profits come before people. I want to save America. I want to build a better world. If all the apparatus they've created for destroying people, for imprisoning people, for breaking people psychologically,
could be utilized to build and to construct. If popular power were put in control of the means of production and control of the state apparatus of the United States, we could build something very, very beautiful.
They want you to be mad at Russia and China instead of the looters that are sitting not very far from here off Wall Street, who are actively getting bailouts in the billions, arguably even in the trillions, for their gambling debts. That's what we're here against, and that's why we're taking a stand for freedom of speech, because they're going after the movement and anyone who stands against the imperialists, because they know we're a real threat and that's rising. They know we authentically represent the American people. They know that the American people are ready for a change and ready for an end to the wars. And that's why they're cracking down on our First Amendment. They're cracking down on our Fourth Amendment. They're cracking down on all the civil liberties we know and love.
Yep.